In this video, I will show you 10 popular chess traps that so many players have fallen for, and you should be aware of these chess traps so you don't fall for one. So let's move on to our first trap. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, he goes d6. Then you play knight c3, and here bishop g4 is a common move, pinning your knight to the queen. But you can play this amazing move h3. This sets up the trap. If he tries to exchange his bishop for the knight, then you can just take with the queen and you have quite a better position. And if he tries to play bishop h5, then you don't play this g4, but you play this tricky knight takes e5, sacrificing this queen. Now black have two options, taking your queen or taking this knight. Here the most common move is taking your queen, but then you can play this amazing bishop takes f7 check, and after king e7, knight to d5 is just checkmate. And in this position, if he tries to play knight takes e5, then you have to remember this follow-up with queen takes h5. He takes your bishop, then you play queen to b5 check. So after c6, you can grab the knight, and now you have a lead in development and you're also up a pawn and completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, he goes bishop b5. Then you play knight f6. He castle here, then you go knight to g4. And here, strangely enough, so many players have gone h3. But if you place rook e1, then you can just develop the bishop, targeting this pawn. He can play d4. Then you can take this pawn with the knight. And after takes, you play queen to h4 first, putting pressure, so he can play knight f3. Then you play queen takes f2, and after king h1, you can play queen to g1 check, sacrificing the queen. You can take with the knight or with the rook, then it leads to knight to f2, checkmate. And in this position, if he plays the most common move, which is h3, then you can play h5. And after h takes g4, you recapture this pawn, attacking this knight. He can play something like knight e1, but then you can play queen to h4 and it's over for white. He can try playing f4, but you can play g3 to shut down this final escape square for the white's king. He can play queen h5, but then you can just checkmate him on the next move. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, d5, c4, you play e5. This is the Alvin counter gambit. He takes this pawn, then you play d4, preventing this knight from developing to this natural square. Then he goes e3, trying to get rid of this pawn. You play this amazing move bishop to b4 check. This sets up the trap. Here bishop d2 seems like a natural response, but you can play d takes e3, sacrificing this bishop. And here white have two options, either to take this pawn or take your bishop. If it takes your pawn, then you can play queen to h4 check, and after g3 you can bring your queen and attack these pawns and the rook. And if he tries to play the most obvious move, bishop takes b4, then you can take this pawn. He cannot take, otherwise his queen is hanging, so he plays king e2. But then you can promote to a knight with check, and after rook takes, you can play bishop g4 check, and you can take the queen and you are completely winning. And even though here, if he doesn't take your knight or play something like moving his king back, then you can just bring in the queen and play queen to e4 check, forking this king and the rook, and then you can just take the rook and now you're winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, c5, d4, c takes d4, he plays c3. This is the Smith-Morag gambit. You can take this pawn as well, and after knight takes, you play knight c6. He goes knight f3, then you play e6. He goes bishop c4, then you play queen to c7. He castle here, then you develop the other knight. And here, queen to e2 seems like a logical move, defending this bishop in case you move this knight, which will be a discovered attack on this bishop. And here you play this tricky knight g4, Here, if he plays rook to d1, then we have a equal game. But the most common move is h3, attacking your knight. Then you play this brilliant knight to d4, sacrificing this knight and forking this queen and this knight, which is protecting the h2 square. If he plays knight takes d4, then you can checkmate him in one move. If he plays queen to d3, trying to save his queen, then you can just take this knight. And after pawn takes or queen takes, you play queen h2 checkmate again. And if he tries to play h takes g4, then you can take his queen, and now you are up a queen and completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. This trap is against the rule of base. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, you play a6. And here he goes bishop a4. Then you play d6, opening up this bishop. He tries to play d4, threatening to play d5. Then you play b5, attacking this bishop. And after bishop b3, you can play knight takes d4. And after takes, here the best move is a4. But no one is going to play that. Queen takes d4 seems like a natural response, but you can play this amazing c5. He goes queen d5, attacking this rook, but you play bishop e6, counter attacking the queen. And after queen c6, you attack the queen further. He goes queen d5, but then c4 traps the bishop, and you will be up a piece and completely winning. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, d5, c4, you play e6, he goes knight c3, then you play knight f6, bishop g5, and here you play this tricky knight bd7. The best move is e3, but if he plays the most natural looking move, knight takes d5, trying to put pressure on this knight because it is pinned to the queen, you can play this amazing knight takes d5, sacrificing this queen. And since you capture this knight, he can have no option but to take the queen. Otherwise, you will be up a piece. But then you can play this amazing bishop to b4 check. And now he can't do much, so you have to block with the queen. And then you can just take his queen. And now after king takes, you can take the bishop. And you are up a piece and completely winning in just 8 moves. Let's move on to our next trap. After e4, e6, d4, d5, you play knight c3, he goes knight f6, then you play e5, attacking this knight. He goes knight fd7, then you play knight f3, he goes bishop b4, pinning this knight to the king. Then you play bishop d3, and here the best move is c5, but castling seems like a natural response, but this is losing because of this amazing move, bishop takes f7 check. And after king takes, you play knight to g5 check. Now he goes back, then you can play queen h5, threatening mate in 1. The best move is to give up the queen and continue the game, but he is going to play rook to e8, trying to create some escape square for the king. Then you don't play queen h7 check, but first play queen takes f7 check. And after king to h8, you play queen h5 check. He goes king g8, then you play queen to h7 check. And after king f8, you play queen h8 check. King e7 is the only legal move, then you can take this pawn and it's a checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4, knight f6, c4, you play e5. This is the Budapest gambit. He takes, then you play knight g4, attacking this pawn. He goes bishop f4, then you play knight c6, putting even more pressure. So he plays knight f3, then you play bishop b4 check. He blocks with the knight, then you play queen e7, putting more pressure on this pawn. And the most common move played here is a3, attacking this bishop. But you can shock him with this amazing knight g takes e5. Here the best move for white is knight takes e5, and after you recapture, he takes. You take his knight first, otherwise he will lose the bishop. Then after queen takes, you recapture and the position is equal. But here, so many players have gone 8 takes b4, capturing your bishop, but this loses to this amazing knight to d3, smothered checkmate. He can't take with this pawn because it is pinned to the queen. Let's move on to our next trap. After d4 e5, he takes. He played knight c6. He goes knight f3. Then you play queen e7, attacking this pawn. He goes bishop f4. Then you play queen to b4 check, forking this king, the b2 pawn, and this bishop. And here bishop d2 is the most common move. Then you take this pawn with the queen. He goes bishop c3, attacking this queen and defending this rook. But you play bishop to b4, pinning this bishop to the king. He takes your bishop and you recapture with the queen. Queen d2 seems like a natural response, trying to trade queens, but you play queen to b2, attacking this rook again. And here the best move is to play c3 and allow black to take the rook. But so many players have gone queen to c3, trying to defend this rook with the queen, but it loses to queen to c1, checkmate. Let's move on to our next trap. This chess trap is best against the fried liver attack, and you can beat your opponent in just 10 moves. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, you play knight f6, he goes knight g5, the fried liver attack. Then you play d5, and after e takes d5, you play knight d4. Here, the best move is c3, but so many players have gone d6, reopening this thread of knight takes f7. But you play queen takes d6, and here he happily goes knight takes f7, forking the queen and the rook. But you play queen c6, attacking this bishop and this g2 pawn. You have to guard this knight, otherwise if he moves his bishop back, he will lose the knight, so he plays knight takes rook. But you can take this pawn with the queen. You have to play rook f1 to save the rook. Then you play queen to e4 check. He can't block with the queen, otherwise you take with the knight. So he goes bishop e2, but then knight to f3 is a smothered checkmate. And you win the game in 10 moves. Well, this is not the end. If you want to learn some more amazing chess traps like these, then you can check out this left playlist. And if you want to solve some amazing chess puzzles, then you can check out this right playlist. And if you don't want to miss the upcoming videos, then don't forget to subscribe.